Actually, I guess it's time. So shall we begin?
Okay.
Okay. So this is the second lecture in this series by Professor Tayfun Sönmez. Just as the announcement as before. So this lecture will be recorded and broadcast. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So think of your privacy. Okay. On that note, so I'm very happy to have Tayfun again, giving a talk on evolution via living donor organ exchange and proof of concept via U.S. Army branches. So, Tayfun, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And just for clarification, so the lecture notes that are posted for the course page, I couldn't cover the full lecture one. I think there was too much material there. I should divide into two parts. So I added the part that I missed mostly to this lecture. There was also a conclusion which I couldn't do, but conclusion I can do at the end of the course anyways. So maybe it's a better way. We learned also a lot from the living donor organ exchanges. Remember that, in the first maybe 10 plus years of my academic career, after PhD, I was trying to, do impact and research at the same time and trying to find my way, largely, as an outsider, and as a result, I was kind of trying to follow my intuition lead, right? And as a result, I wasn't literally following a paradigm. I was doing just what I feel just makes sense. But now when I organize all I did, it seems like what I'm doing now seems to be same as what I was just doing anyways, except I'm now more conscious about certain details. I know what works, what doesn't work. So I will start this lecture with what I missed last lecture, which I couldn't cover, living donor organ exchanges. And basically, what I learned from those experiences, further reinforced, my, confidence about the broader framework. Okay, and then starting early 2010s, I think literally around 2010, another opportunity happened for another application, branching process at the US Army. And at that point, starting that point, I was consciously actually literally applying a formula. Okay? And we'll also see, what that led to in the bigger part of the second lecture. And that's what I mean by proof of concept. It's the proof of concept of the entire frame. Okay. So when, in early 2000s, one of the most unexpected applications of market design, which really helped the field, was kidney exchange. We pursued this research and policy program with Al Roth and Utku Ünver in a series of papers, later also together with Frank Delmonico and Susan Seidel. And this application was very well received. Within a few years, it already started making a significant impact. And within a decade, it started saving more than 1,000 lives annually. So why was this unexpected? Well, this was way outside traditional domain of economics, right? And And also, I should highlight that just like in the case of Boston Public School Choice Reform, help from economists was volunteered as outsiders. We weren't invited for it. Okay, so that is the theme I've been emphasizing again and again. Okay. Now, so how did three economists manage to develop the tools for and help to establish the infrastructure which regularly saves so many lives? So how did we manage this? So the key was, in a nutshell, convincing stakeholders who are policymakers, system operators, patient groups, that we can help them to improve their institution in aspects they care about, not in aspects just economists, care about. The society cares. By using the tools they are familiar, okay, or at least they're comfortable to use, and without creating any issues. Right? You cannot just help with one thing and then mess up with something else. That will not work. That will never work. Okay? So to have a realistic chance to influence policy, an aspiring market designer needs to have an in-depth understanding of the mission of the institution, along with a practical and transparent plan to improve it. And often the history of the institution can be very instructive. It is typically instructive, more so than it can be. It is actually. And so one important point is, if you have policy aspirations, like if you are not writing papers just to get published and be famous, but if you actually want to change an institution, of course, if you can do both, that's great. But if the primary objective is actually having policy impact, this has big implications on the research question. Like you cannot just ask arbitrary questions and expect that people will be receptive to it. I just haven't seen. I mean, the research that you develop, like in 40 years, somebody else, might gain insight and change the world. So obviously, I'm not discouraging that line of work, but you'll not be seeing, you'll not be seeing the product yourself. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So, how did kidney exchange start in New England? So, it wasn't started by us. Okay. Approved by the UNOS Board of Trustees in fall 2000, the first kidney exchange program in the US was established in New England, which is UNOS Region 1 in the US in February 2001. Okay. In order to overcome barriers to living donation due to biological incompatibilities, the program made two types of arrangements. The first one is the paired kidney exchange, or standard two-way exchange. Two pairs who are typically incompatible with their own, two donors who are incompatible, biologically incompatible with their patient, intended patient, more like two patients who are biologically incompatible with their donors, just swap donors. Okay, so this makes what is impossible possible in terms of living donation. Okay, so that's the first type of arrangement. Second type of arrangement, the problem is, the first one is kind of hard to organize, right? One pair alone cannot just say, I want to have an exchange. They need to find another pair for the exchange. The second arrangement is much easier. Okay? So in that case, an incompatible pair, an incompatible pair, make a trade with the deceased donor coach. Okay? Their donor donates to the deceased donor list, and they get priority in the deceased donor list. Okay? So So they started doing that in New England. So the paired kidney exchange or two-way exchange or direct exchange, two-way direct exchange, well, that's also not discovered by economists. It was originally proposed by a transplant surgeon, Rapoport, in '86. And he's a very prominent surgeon, and he was the editor of a transplant journal for like 30 years or so. Okay. It was first carried out in South Korea in 1991, and much of the big innovations in kidney exchange are made in South Korea, actually. Okay. Now, in 2000, transplantation community issued a consensus statement saying that this is ethically okay. And this is as good as you'll hear from transplant surgeons. It's a very high praise. Okay. And the consensus statement urged that all four operations be carried out simultaneously so that no patient finds herself in a situation where their donor donated, but then the other donor became unavailable for a variety of reasons.
Sorry, that one is for the paired exchange.
So that is for two-way exchange.
Two-way exchange.
And they weren't even thinking about three-way, four-way. And they didn't think it's necessary, actually. I think they had the wrong intuition that, if I can do it four-way, I can also do it two-way, which is not quite correct, as we have shown later on. Okay. But because of that simultaneity constraint, those larger exchanges are considerably harder anyways, logistically, right? So until we really pushed for those later on and showing how important they are, they weren't on the table. And in the US, the first two-way exchange was carried out in Rhode Island in 2000. List exchange was also introduced by transplant surgeons and ethicists, medical ethicists in 2000. Its major appeal is organizational simplicity. You're an incompatible pair, you don't need to find any other pair. You just make a trade with the deceased donor queue, right? But then there were big ethical concerns that what you will typically give to the deceased donor queue is not the same as what you'll receive. If I'm an O patient, blood type O can only receive for O, it will be typically O type patients, blood type O patients, because if they have an A donor, B donor, AB donor, they're automatically incompatible, right? They are the most likely people who, apply for this program. But then basically you're interfering with the distribution of kidneys in the deceased donor, right? And then, different ethnic backgrounds have different, blood type distributions, making the things even more complicated. For instance, minorities are heavier in, blood type O in the US. Okay, so already when they introduced list exchange, in the same paper they highlighted the ethical concern. Right? They are not like economists. Okay, you have this great idea, let's do it. Right? They are saying there's a potential idea, and here's a big ethical concern about it.
Did you know whether that's actually numerically important at this point, or this potential detrimental effect on the blood type O patients? So is it backed by some data?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so, and in the consensus statement also, as I mentioned here, the transplantation community didn't say you cannot do it, that they didn't forbid it, but they put a big distance to it.
I see.
So basically, because of that, blood type donation structure, because of that natural injustice against type O patients.
Actually, what I wondered about is that if all patients bring some A-type donors and so on, presumably A-type donors will receive the kidney quickly, so that could shorten the queue as well. So I want to share.
No, but it's not the same. So sure, it helps the maybe average speed, but it makes the O type. So don't think of all blood types. As you see, that's the problem with several economics papers. When you write a kidney exchange paper with no blood type, abstracting that detail, the average might improve. But basically, all type patients there, think of it as one queue, A type, think of it as another queue. You can think of it as a list of nested queues. Like it's not entirely listed, actually, partially or ordered list. So that can be in more complex ways, right? Given this blood type donation system. But at the end of the day, no matter what you do, unless you mitigated it in some way, and we show how they can mitigate it, like in New England, most of the kidneys that were taken from the list, this is on the list, was blood type O kidneys. And so there is that data which backs that. There was already data which backs that, when we got involved. So, despite the ethical concerns, New England included list exchange in its program. Why? Because it's a lot easier to organize, right? But they were also very defensive about, they said, this exchange program has a clear utilitarian goal to have more recipients undergo successful transplantation by expanding the pool of compatible live donors. So they included in the program and also apologized for it, right? Defended it. We have to do it. Like. So reflecting these concerns, however, if you look at Delmonico et al. 2004 paper, which announces this program, it involves the precautions taken to mitigate the adverse impact on lift exchange on type O patients on the deceased donor waiting list. Like, a good part of the paper is really about how they are avoiding hurting certain subpopulations. Nonetheless, despite being the less preferred type of kidney exchange, most transplants arranged by the New England's program in its early phases were from list exchanges. So in the 3-year period between 2001 and 2003, there were 17 list exchanges, which gives 17 transplants, as opposed to only four two-way exchanges, but you have 2 transplants in each two-way exchange, so that's 2 transplants. Still, more than 2/3 of the transplants were from list exchanges, despite its less favored situation. And if you look at these numbers are very small for direct exchange, actually, a bit more than 1 a year, right? What was the problem? What's the root cause of the problem? Well, prior to our involvement in fall 2004, the program did not have a unified database between all its programs where participating centers could access information on patient donor pairs co-registered in other centers. So people were making phones. So this explains small number of transplants from paired kidney exchange, two-way exchange in early years of the program. But actually, the number of list exchanges, it wasn't too high either. Even though it does not require a patient donor database. Because there were also operational challenges for list exchanges as well, mostly because of the ethical concerns about it, right? So basically, the New England team, they want to assure the population that we are doing the list exchange only as a last precaution, right? Remember the apologetic tone that was also reflected in the policies. In particular, a prerequisite for the eligibility for list exchange was to assure that no paired kidney exchange is feasible between that particular pair and any other pair in all 14 centers. Now, how did you figure that out when there is no database, right? So basically, they were waiting a few months, and who knows what exactly was going on. So timing is very important. Right? We appeared under these conditions, right? And knowing what is going on. Right? You cannot go to doctors and say, I have a great idea and expect that they will embrace you. So I mean, their training is very different, their reasoning is very different, and not all economists are also very respectful for other fields or institutions, and I don't think our profession is doing particularly well in that dimension. Right? You would hear words like, ivory tower, economists, academicians, like lots of people think us as, clueless guys. I mean, don't you think? Right? So, but we came with a good plan, right? We knew the problem. And if you ever interact with policymakers, you gotta know what's going on very well. You gotta understand what might matter for them. Like if you are lucky enough to have a meeting with those people, relevant people, you gotta make the best of it. It's unlikely that anybody will give you a second chance. Okay. So under these circumstances, we shared the first draft of Sönmez with Dr. Francis Delmonico in September 2003, I believe, and conveyed our interest to support them to improve their kidney exchange program. Now, but how did we write the paper in the first place? Right? So, how were we, prepared? So, at the time, I was at Koç University, Istanbul, as was Utku, but Utku was visiting Alvin Roth at Harvard University for the academic year 2002-2003. So it turns out Utku was presenting the paper that I mentioned to you about house allocation with the existing tenants last lecture, right, where there's this hidden bias. So apparently, in the first week of his visit, Roth alerted him that our paper and house allocation with the existing tenants model has an unusual application in kidney transplantation. Okay, and basically, if you can think of patients with living donors as existing tenants, right? Paired donor kidneys, basically they are donors, are kind of like the occupied houses, right? They will only be available if the patient himself gets a kidney, right? Patients on the deceased donor list are analogous to newcomers who doesn't have, any house, in this case, any, kidney, access to any kidney. And deceased donor kidneys are analogous to vacant houses. Okay. So, upon hearing that, I got very excited. so, I mean, some of you might know I'm an overly excited guy, which doesn't always serve me well. Okay, so I said, okay, we gotta write about this. Okay, so Rolf didn't think this is feasible. And he was, like, he had very valid reasons. He gave us two reasons. The first reason was, I mean, this is a paper in transplantation. Like, how can you write a paper about transplantation? So I don't, I can read about, my brother is a doctor. I was confident enough, I can learn enough to make sense. The second reason was perhaps more important, and I think it reflects our difference in view, reflects his positive view of economics versus my normative view of economics. Like, he thought, well, I mean, you already published a paper. Obviously, you can use, you request my house, I get your term mechanism, or its equivalent TTC mechanism. What is there to write? Right? The problem is, it's just another application, right? So upon digging about the problem, I'm like, so, I mean, the way my personality is, when I see something like this, I just cannot stop thinking about it. Like, for me, it's not about publication, it's just, like, I dream about it, I think about it, I just want to learn everything, right? So I immediately, yes.
Tayfun, so at this very early stage, did you know that only paired exchange
Yes.
is practically
Yes,
feasible?
yes, because and at the time we didn't know larger exchanges will be as critical. Okay, and in our paper, actually, in first paper, we allow for arbitrary size exchanges, right? And indeed, that could have been one way to pursue, right? We can say, you know what, you request my house, I get your turn. There are arbitrary size, cycles and chains. We can look at two ways. That wasn't my initial instinct. Okay. Although it would have been a very reasonable instinct, as you see very shortly, right? My instinct was, because I'm so normatively oriented, and one benefit of being theorist is the following. Like, what are we? We are about linking axioms to each other, like how these little dynamics affects other parts of the system. So when you think like that, so if you manage to do something similar with real life institutions and real life principles, you start getting, okay, you know what? Like, they are, on the one hand, they invented the simplest version of chains, just the chains which just include one patient rather than longer chains, along with the simplest version of cycles. So basically, doctors invented the simplest force of cycles, which include only two people. I'm ignoring trivial cycles, which would mean the pair is compatible. Okay, and they invented the simplest form of chains, right? But they were worried about chains, right? Because of ethical concerns. So I figured, you know what? If I can use larger chains, perhaps I can avoid this ethical dilemma, or I can bring enough gain from the system that the gains from one part of the system compensates from the potential distributional cost to all patients, right? The system is so inefficient, I figured, we should be able to give them something, and not only in terms of efficiency, but in terms of their ethical concepts. So, and all my career, actually, I think what I've been trying to do is, I'm trying to change a disadvantage, a friction into my advantage, right? I'm trying to use the arguments used against us to actually convince them that, well, you know what? You have this concern, but in this context, you're ignoring it. Whereas now I'll be taking care of all of it. So basically, I didn't want to directly propose, you look at my house, I get your turn mechanism. I wanted to propose a variety of mechanisms differing with this chain selection. So for instance, you can do things like, well, if you have a negative surplus for a particular organ, you might not do the chain at all, for instance, right? Of course, I was ignoring the size constraints at the time, right? But our initial point wasn't really making the mechanism win. We were just trying to be accepted as, relevant parties, which can contribute to the system, right? Sometimes in market design, outcome will be very specific. You'll support the mechanism, but our biggest contributions in kidney exchange are not the mechanisms. It's rather the tools that we bring to the table. So you shouldn't think of an institution just as a particular mechanism. I've been historically asked questions like, why is this game theory? Well, why should it be game theory in the first place? Right? Improving institutions may be about game theory if the key issue is about information, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's about property rights, or it could be other issues. But because the field is mechanism design is invented by game theorists, like the instinct is converting everything to a game, and that is one of the problems as far as other fields and policymakers are concerned, actually. And then they're concerned that economists are changing the nature of the problem, right? So anyways, we convinced Rob that he said, go ahead, why don't you write this? I said, okay, but, we would love to see you. We'll show you what we can do. So we wrote the first draft, exactly building on, these aspects. And the version that we initially posted has written actually had potential multiple donors for each patient. I think that working paper version is also available on my website. Okay, so anyways, so that we seem to know what we are doing, both in terms of medical details, and we have a way to go beyond making this look like a direct application of Abdülkadir Sönmez. He was happy to join us, and I think obviously that added strength to our visibility of our effort. And basically, we circulated the first version, and importantly addressed both goals of the transplantation community, both the utilitarian goal and their ethical concerns, with this paper. Okay. So at that point, Rod was with us, and I was in Turkey. I wouldn't be able to communicate with New England transplantation community, and of course, just too young, and he was, I think, third year assistant professor. So Rod made the initial contact, and actually he had a graduate student like Jennifer Stack. I think she accompanied them, and our informed and cautious approach resonated with Dr. Delmonico, who was then the chief medical officer at New England Organ Bank. He was also president-elect for UNOS, United Nations Organ Sharing, which is basically the contractor which handles all transplantation in the US. Okay. But then subsequently, he made the following request. He said, first of all, he was impressed with the claim. We made lots of simulations. We gave different scenarios. If you use this chain selection, that, if you use that one, that, and I think we even made some simulations with short cycles, right? So in this particle, even though that wasn't part of the theory, it was part of the simulations. So basically, he said, if you can give us these kind of gains, why do we bother with list exchange in the first place? Like, given even though that was mainly what they were doing, so he suggested, you don't need list exchange in the system with these kind of potential gains. But he said, due to logistical constraints, we should only allow for 2-way kidney exchanges. We cannot carry larger exchanges. And to avoid a situation where patients and hospitals may compete for donors with certain characteristics, we must assume that patients are indifferent between all compatible donors. So that was the big, basically 2 and 3 required an entirely different methodology, right? It's a different model now. Okay. Fortunately, just around, a lot of what we are doing also depends on luck. I wouldn't know how to solve this problem right away, at least. Okay. But just a few months earlier, Hervé Moulin and Anna Bogomolets and Moulin published a paper in Econometrica, which solved a special case of that problem, where there were 2 sides, and this is only one-sided. And think of patients and donors as a single party. So here you can match anybody with anybody. So this is kind of like, what is asked is kind of like a roommate's problem. Okay. Whereas Anna and Hervé, they solved the 2-side matching version of the problem. It's an abstract study. And then they also made a comment that there are related results for the more general version. So we checked what it is and realized that there is a huge literature about the abstract version of that problem. A lot was already done anyways, right? By Galay, Edmonds, like in 1950s, 60s. That allowed us to write a second paper, which we later published in Journal of Economic Theory. And essentially, it's kind of like a hybrid between Hervé's and Anna's paper and our first paper, right? And we were able to write that fast, and Damoka was very impressed that people can do this kind of thing, meaning usually they think we are like managers, MBAs. And
I have a somewhat I don't know, question about this paper. So so as I remember, you both have a deterministic mechanism and also a stochastic mechanism. So from technical point of view, the stochastic one was really well, I actually hard as well as very elegant. So how was that part received by?
Very good question. So see, I'm not entirely ignorant to publishing. And unfortunately, over the years, it became absolutely clear that smart idea, novel idea means nothing to my peers in economics, especially in economic theory. So I need to show some muscle, right? So this is how I write my papers. I find an idea. If I know that the idea is really good, like it can save lives, like it can change the world, how do I make the best of it, right? So when I start the paper, I already know my conclusion. I already know my punchline. Like the broad structure is already ready. But I don't want to write that white paper, right? You know, you get to feed my family, right? And my papers are too difficult for many fields, right? Their messages are clear. They like the messages. They want to use it. But somebody needs to referee my paper. They are called economic theorists. Right? They're very tough. And they don't always care for, if I say, I can save lots of lives. So I don't mind. So then write a white paper. Okay. So what I try to find is how I can make this stuff analytically also very interesting. Right? So if you read my papers, and I kind of learned how to do that over the years. But it's almost like a combination of two papers, right? Certain sections are intended for real people, policymakers, like introduction, maybe section 2, conclusion. And there is this middle stuff, you know, like I usually use theory, which develops theory. And unfortunately, a good part of my referees are only interested in that part. They would sometimes ask to get rid of the more interesting part. But I mean, I was aware of this from an early stage and somehow managed. I had many frustrations. Some of our best papers had lots of difficulties. I mean, so that stochastic mechanism is in the paper, not because I believe that people will do lotteries for kidney transplantation. Doctors don't like lotteries. They like priorities. But I was pretty sure that my referee will say, oh, this is too simple. Like the priority. It's obvious, right? What is not obvious is the model. Model is the most important thing of what we are doing. It's the quality of the model that changes the world, not the analytical result, but our referees don't agree, right? And of course, it's better if you can do this in a smooth way, right? In a way that doesn't look weird. That's what we learned over time. Right? And sometimes those high-level ideas even become relevant. But basically, the role of that part is essentially the referees are expecting me to advance pure theory, not really applied theory. And fortunately, we are able to do that. Although I don't think this is a reasonable expectation. I think so anyways. But you got to use good judgment in what you are presenting to policymakers, right? And if we went to the I said, look, we have this egalitarian mechanism and strategy proof, and like you know, the proof is complicated. Like you say, okay, like I spent enough time with these guys. So this second paper was very well received by Delmonico. But then there was one problem. We wanted to call the program New England Program for Kidney Exchange. Why? Because there's kidney exchange. Our papers were called kidney exchange. We wanted to get credit for what we are doing, right? Then Monica was worried that the word exchange might be interpreted like Wall Street, money exchange, right? So I think just because of that, we lost like maybe 4 or 5 months, just because of the name of the program. Okay. At the time, they introduced a new, and kidney exchange, by the way, wasn't our terminology to start with. Doctors found that terminology, but now they want to call it kidney pair donation, right? So anyways, I mean, I don't know how much we insisted, I don't remember, but it was a concern, this was discussed. But more importantly, it showed me even how I write my papers is extremely important, right? I put one wrong word there, people in other fields might get the wrong ideas. This guy is neoclassical, profit maximizer, trying to make everybody strategic, suddenly they start seeing a devil, right? So anyways, so our team meaning UTKU, coded and ran NEPGES software for several years. Our paper partnership resulted in a number of additional breakthroughs. For example, it became clear that larger exchanges, especially three-way exchanges, are extremely important. And we convinced our medical colleagues, given the size of the benefits, and they were happy to go ahead with it. And we even published a paper with them on the importance of three-way exchanges, and that became standard in the world. We also introduced the concept of non-directed donor chains, the same kind of chains we had in our original paper. Well, at the time, Good Samaritan donors was not a big thing. There weren't like, these are donors, living donors who just donate anonymously to do good. That was a rare thing. Well, I could, it's mathematically the same thing. Like the chain can be started by either trade with the deceased donor or available kidney, right? I can use the exact same kind of mechanism, right? So, but we didn't talk about that in the original paper because it wasn't a big thing. But by then it started becoming big, and then we proposed these two concepts, and in particular, we proposed the following idea. Look, you want all operations to be simultaneous, and that has efficiency implications, but for the case of chains, you might not need simultaneous. Why? Well, if a two-way exchange or three-way exchange breaks, two things happen. Somebody gets a kidney without giving one, and somebody gives a kidney without getting one. The problematic one is the second one, not the first one, right? Whereas if people first receive and then give, this is irrelevant, which means you can actually have long chains. And we convinced our colleagues, and we introduced this notion, and it became a really big thing, actually. These chains start with Good Samaritan donors. Around the same time, we also supported another group, Alliance for Pair Donation, APD, but it was actually Ohio Consortium before that. The name was different. And a big part of the gains today are from NDD chains, non-directed donor chains. Why? Because of organizational simplicity, right? And you can do it over time. There was, I mean, there was one problem for was also very interesting. It was one practical problem, which was also analytical problem. The problem was the following. Now, since preferences are assumed to be strict, compatible pairs participate in kidney exchange in the first paper. Right? People can join just to get a better kidney. But Delmonico requested us to assume that, everybody is indifferent between all compatible kidneys, which means for compatible pairs, there is no reason in the model to join. Right? That resulted in huge efficiency loss. For me, what was very interesting was a modeling choice, because of the way it affected the pool of participants, can change the future of an institution and lives of so many people. Like if I'm an A patient, I have an O donor, I have no longer any reason to participate in exchange. Nobody will even mention it to us. While there are tons of O patients with A donors or B donors who are waiting here, right? So when we go from Sönmez 2004 to 2005, the efficiency gain was cut into half. Not a bit because of the size of the exchanges, but largely because we lost pairs like that. Okay. So, thinking, what can be done to include these harder to match pairs in kidney exchange? I'm still working on this because this is very important. One possibility pursued by Mike Rees and Alvin Roth is global kidney exchange. What you can do is you can match harder to match pairs with patient donor pairs from countries where there is no possibility of living donation. Right? So there are some willing donors in, say, India, Mexico, Philippines, but there's no technology, or they might not have money. Right? So this idea is very heavily promoted for, I think, close to a decade now, or maybe 8 years at least, right? And it is actually pursued by APD, Alliance for Pair Donation. But the numbers are very small. It's only 52 transplants, including 17 international and 35 US. I mean, there are some, Newsweek stories, like even like cover page stories about this, because like when there's an exchange between Mexico and US, it's news, right? But the matter of the fact is, the gains are very modest. The gains are very modest. Like in the same period, the total in US is more than 6,000. So you get 35 to US patients from 17 internationals, right? So how come? So I think this reflects the positive approach of Alvin Roth to economic versus our normative approach. So a big challenge for global kidney exchange is the mixed reaction in the transplantation community. Doctors don't like this idea, or at least a good number of doctors don't like this idea. And they undermine that. They say that it undermines various ethical norms in transplantation. And basically, persuasion stage is not performed, I guess, because we were not there, right? Yeah. And indeed, remember Dr. Delmonico, he was even in Sweden, you can find his pictures with Al Roth in the Nobel ceremony as a very important contributor of kidney exchange. He made kidney exchange possible, Delmonico, right? But he is very opposed to global kidney exchange. Indeed, he published a paper called opposition to irresponsible global kidney exchange. Not only he published that, he also organized a big, group, and they had a declaration at a major conference about ethical objections to proposed global kidney exchange program, right? So what's the point that I'm making? You cannot just make any wild idea, ignore worries. I mean, what are the worries? According to this group, the program exploits 2 countries and individuals. Like you do exchange, and then the donor stays there. What happens if something goes wrong for the donor? Okay. Like, how do you manage somebody's not selling that using this to start black market? Right? It's not as easy as you to avoid those things within a closed system. So I'm not against global kidney exchange. However, to me, the following is clear. These are not concerns I can just make go away as an economist. I cannot say this is not important, right? And if you say it, I'll never be able to interact with these guys and things will just not happen, right? So I think, to me, this illustrates the importance of the persuasion stage that I've been emphasizing. That's my bigger point. Okay. So how can we improve efficiency without this kind of issue? One idea we proposed is called incentivized kidney exchange. If you have a kidney patient, you didn't lose your kidney because somebody stabbed it. There's something systematically wrong in your body. And if your kidney went bad, in 20 years, it will go again bad because of the same systematic problem. So what we have proposed is, I'm an A patient, I have an O donor. If rather than directly getting the transplant, if I participate in exchange, thereby saving other lives too. And this is a really good trade for the system, right? I'm giving something more valuable, like, because when I'm a patient, use O donor, I'm using something more valuable than I need. We suggested giving priority in the cadaveric queue. The next time this happens, if it happens, and it's easy to show that in various ways you can get priority improvements for all kinds of groups, right? It's a win-win for everybody. But the problem is, and I mean, according to some, like if everybody participates in incentivized kidney exchange, we found that you can triple the number of transplants from kidney exchange. So that's probably optimistic, but the gains are very considerable. And indeed, the ethics of this policy received was taken very positively by members of Canadian transplantation community. Okay. But nonetheless, this is a hard sell. Even though we are, caring a lot for ethical considerations. Why? Because it's too complicated. It's kind of not that easy to explain to the society. Broader consensus is needed. Because why? You are influencing the national disease donation policy, which has a lot more political aspects. So the gains are huge. The gains are huge, but it's tough. Why? Because it interferes with another program, disease donation.
Oh, sorry. So just check. So are you saying that the deceased donor queue is actually organized by someone else?
It is own units, but they have different rules.
Okay, I see.
That is also questioned now. This is under scrutiny right now because they've been in charge for almost 40 years and apparently they've been extremely inefficient and there are political issues. And there's a huge backslash about us. And indeed, that might be a good opportunity. This might be a good time to integrate this. But this point as big as the benefits are, it's harder to make. Right? Well, perhaps if I was, as famous as, leaders in the field, maybe I could have made that, but I don't have that kind of visibility. But this is one idea.
Another
What-
question.
yes.
Sorry, another question is, so previously you mentioned that if you just do the priority for the cyst queue, that might hurt all patients. And
Yes.
in this proposal also.
So yeah, everybody benefits. Everybody benefits. You'll just need to be careful about, the parameters of the mechanism, right?
Okay.
So but there's a rich range of, like, this is not an axiomatic, like we have lots of simulations. It's a continuum model. Okay, but basically because, like, whenever I have a compatible pair, I put them in the system, I take the more valuable kidney from them, right? And they only use, maybe if they need it in 20 years, the less valuable time. It's not difficult to see that. The gain is like huge, right? I mean, and like the gain is so huge, like basically now I'm giving the valuable thing. Maybe I will never ever need to interact with the deceased donor queue. If I do, it's like 15, 20 years, and I will only get the less valuable one because the patient, like, is blood type A or B or AB, right? So it's easy to see that this will give Pareto gains, right? It's a very good idea. It's just it's difficult. It's difficult. Next, but for other organs, there might be easier ways to make it more local without, going through local policies. One idea for liver exchanges, we can utilize size compatibility requirements in living donor kidney transplantation. I'm an A patient, I'm an O donor, but my O donor can donate either the left lobe, small left lobe, or the right lobe. But in my case, I need the right lobe. Okay, because I'm a big guy. And indeed, if you have two same size people, you'll need the right lobe anyways. Okay, so but the right lobe is like 5 times riskier for the donor. The death rate is like 4 or 5 times more. Other complications are 4 or 5 times more. So now, how about my donor donates to a small patient, the left lobe to a small patient, okay, like she is O patient, she is an A donor. A liver is okay for me anyways, and like liver in bad situation, like O patient, A donor, like whether left lobe or right lobe, they'll be very happy anyways, because they're incompatible. So that's a really good deal for them, because if you have liver disease, if you need liver transplant, if there is no transplant, you'll die in a very short time. Like there is nothing like dialysis. Okay. And for us, well, I mean, I still receive my transplant, it's the same thing for me, but my donor doesn't need to go through that kind of risk. Right? Now we can utilize, so I can incorporate this idea in the system with local policies, right? I don't need to affect the national policy. Okay. So basically, what I'm trying to illustrate is that people say, what's the difference between kidney and liver? It's very different. If you are looking at the details, institutional in this case, like there will be different instruments depending on aspects. Economists think is completely irrelevant, abstract, too much abstraction. Like this idea of, let's say, general idea and only that matters, is a little bit too much, right? detail really matters in what we are doing. I'm not saying, like, of course, if you want to just get broad ideas, sure. But if you want to influence real life policies, you know, there can be lots of opportunities. And here there is, subsequently we learned that there are other opportunities in liver too. Apparently there are variations in, you know, liver structures, in how many veins you have. The simpler that structure, the better for the patient. And so there are even more reasons. And indeed, these ideas resonated with a group at Turkey, which is the biggest liver transplant center in Turkey, and the second biggest in the world. So they conduct about 250, 300 living donor transplants annually. And the US total last year was like about 600. So it's a big program. And 3 years ago, we established an agreement for a liver exchange program that honors my late wife. And that's a long story, but definitely, I mean, she made big sacrifices so that this field flourished, actually. You know, so it is a big story. And I'm obviously very passionate, especially passionate about this program. But because of the COVID, it couldn't start for several years. Last year, it's started, and despite the 7.8 earthquake in that region, so far through this program, a four-way exchange is carried out. That's a world first. Three ways carried out, 4 two-way liver exchanges. I think there's another one actually. So, so indeed, we utilize this opportunity. And I mean, if you're serious about market design, of course, I mean, I don't need to be in the operation, right? But you gotta be there. You gotta show that you're serious. You're not there to make money, and you're sincere. And one thing that's easy with kidney exchange and liver exchange, we weren't really trying to break anything. Like we were saying, your system is bad. Well, we were saying for the kidney exchange, but it was so bad that it was so obvious. Nobody was getting offended, right? So in market design, establishing a new system might be a lot easier than replacing a bad one. Okay, so this is also going very slow. So are you guys okay for also going today for 2 hours? I mean, not from here. So let's see how this will go.
Just to let you know, we have a lunch reservation for you.
I'm more than happy to skip the lunch. Lunch means nothing to me. I like this stuff. So we'll see when you guys get annoyed and angry. So I heard that some people were upset that we avoided, we couldn't talk about organ exchange. We did, but now we are late for this one. But I can go a little bit faster with this one, and maybe kind of fast with the technical details. So now what I'll do is the following. I will show how I used all I learned from school choice and kidney exchange and started systematically applying them, pursue a hard reform. In this case, convince army that they have a bad system and they should change it. Right? So that's a lot to expect. Right? So I will show you how this worked, nonetheless. But it wasn't easy. So drawing on a decade-long research and policy efforts on the US Army's branching process of cadets to military specialties, I will now present the first direct application. Direct application meaning, I think school is also great. BPS is a great application. It's just, I wasn't applying the paradigm, not conscious. I mean, I was, but it wasn't conscious. Now it is conscious. Right? I'm making every little calculation. Okay, like basically the political economy of this reform is always in my brain. Okay. So it's the first direct application and subsequent proof of concept. But that took almost a decade. So, I mean, I can skip this stuff I talked a little bit. So what's the problem? Each year, the US Army assigns cadets from West Point and ROTC to their first job in military occupation or branch through a centralized system. And it's very important for their careers. Prior to 2006, cadets were assigned to branches just by simple serial dictatorship based on a performance ranking called Order of Merit list. Like if you like watch American movies, like when I was young, I was watching these movies, somebody was saying, I was top of my class. Like that means get the highest Order of Merit score. It wasn't top. Okay, so it's serial dictatorship, which we talk a lot about, right? It's an obvious, simple, and very plausible mechanism. So their problem was analytically simple at the time, right? It had all the good properties. But using this mechanism also reflects the importance of hierarchy in the army. The army is a very hierarchical institution. Okay. In response to declining junior officer retention rates during the late 90s and early 2000s, starting with the 2006, the Army offered a menu of retention incentives to cadets at these institutions. And the most popular incentive involved a reform of the branching mechanism, and it was called the Branch of Choice Program, BRACO program. So under this program, if you're at West Point, the moment you start, you commit for 5 years of mandatory service. But Army is hoping that you'll stay all the way until you retire. But the mandatory period is 5 years, unless you pay them back $300,000 or something like that. Yeah. So their idea was the following: they are not keeping enough people. They know that cadets care a lot about their match. Why don't we give them priority for a fraction of the seats at each branch in case they couldn't get it with the normal term? Not for all positions, because hierarchy is important. So they were able to do that for 25% of the positions at West Point and 50% of the positions at ROTC. Okay, so this time that they need to serve, I will refer that as a price. It's like a cost, right? Now, but when you integrate this idea, you have now two different types of priorities, right? You have regular priority for regular slots, and then you have the adjusted priority if you are willing to serve additional price or time. The message space was also changed in the mechanism. And in particular, the new message space maintained the old message space. They rank all the branches. And in addition, they indicate which branches, for which they are willing to pay the extra cost in case they couldn't get the cheap one in that choice. Okay, so this is not a direct mechanism. So what about the outcome function in this mechanism? The branch assignments were made a procedure which kind of resembles the serial dictatorship, with one important exception. Once the regular base price positions are filled at any branch, cadets who are willing to pay the increased price are given priority for the remaining flexible price position. Basically, the second priority kicks in, and because of that, you'll also see that there might be some iterative structure, as in serial, as in deferred acceptance, right? You might first get it with normal price, but somebody who couldn't get a better choice might be willing to pay the higher price. So you might need some iterations in that. They determined outcome, the assignment, and prices separately. They first determined the outcome, and there are lots of theories here. So you see that this smells trouble, right? The way they determine the prices, because now the outcome is not just branch assignment, it's also the price of the, how much mandatory service you serve, right? Basically, cadets who receive a regular position are charged the base price. Cadets who receive a flexible price positions are charged the base price if they have not indicated willingness to pay the increased price for their assigned branch, and the increased price if they have indicated willingness to pay the increased price for their assigned branch. Okay, so basically, if you are getting the regular one, you pay the regular price. If you are getting the last 25% at West Point, if you commit, if you said I'm willing to pay, you'll pay it, whether you needed it or not. Okay, so two aspects are not ideal. So basically, cadets are asked whether they are willing to pay the increased price at the branch or not, independent of what is the alternative, right? So they cannot say, I'm willing to pay the increased price if I can get one of my top two choices. I'm willing to pay the increased price for my first choice if I cannot even get my second choice, but I'm willing to pay if I can get, if I were otherwise get 3 or less. Second issue is cadets who indicate willingness to pay the increased price for a branch are charged increased price upon receiving one of his flexible price positions, even if they would have received the same position at the base price in the absence of their willingness. Okay. Now, these issues in turn resulted in the following axiomatic failures, if you wish. Okay. There were detectable priority reversals, like a cadet may receive a position at an increased price, while a lower order of merit this cadet receives a position at the same branch at the base price. And there were also incentive compatibility failures, like I could benefit by not declaring my willingness to pay the increased price, that we call this Brasso-IC. What are the root causes? Like root cause is a big thing in minimalist market design, right? What is wrong with this mechanism? There are two issues. First, the message space is not sufficiently rich, but I'm not able to say my top choice is infantry at the cheap price, second choice is aviation at the cheap price, third choice is infantry at the increased price. I cannot say that. And the second failure is there's a disconnect between how branch assignment and the price assignment are made. Okay. Now, fortunately, and thanks to Fuito, both root cause of the failures can be addressed by, foundational research on matching with contracts by Hatfield and Milgram. So this was a simple fix. Like in Sönmez and Swisser, we proposed cumulative offer mechanism, but then, so we suggested that cadets the system to use a direct mechanism so that you actually rank all branch price pairs. In this case, there were like 17 branches, 2 prices, and then use the cumulative offer mechanism, but not the version by Hatfield and Milgram, because the underlying priority structure by the Army doesn't satisfy a substitution condition, but it does satisfy unilateral substitution. And Fujito and John actually developed the system already for that. So then I made the suggestion to the army. The army said, too much work. We cannot say change the strategy space. Too complicated. Adoption of a mechanism with a more involved message space was initially seen at the army as unnecessary due to three main reasons. First, these failures have been rare. Second, they could be most of the time manually adjusted. Somebody complains, it's typically because you are paying too much. Then they say, oh, okay, we give it up. Problem. Right? Now, there could be additional priority reversals where you couldn't manually fix. Why? Because I received like infantry at the expensive price, even though I prefer aviation at the cheap price. But the mechanism didn't allow me to reveal that. So there might be this issue, but it's invisible to the system. Right? So in summary, any failure of the USMA 2006 mechanism can either be manually exposed and cannot be verified with existing data. So nothing happened. This is kind of like my experience with Turkey. Not important enough. Like nobody cares about, our fancy mechanisms. The solution are not bringing enough to the table to justify a reform. A good mechanism never initiates a reform. You need a bad enough mechanism. In 2012, Army introduced another policy where they want there some heterogeneity in branch priorities. Okay. So they give the opportunity for branches to partition cadets into 3 tiers. Okay. And people in the first tier has higher priority than people in the second tier, so on and so forth. And OML is now only used for tiebreaker within the tier. But as a result, they also need to change what they do with Bratzo, right? What they decided to do is to make use of that. Okay, sorry. Initially, they didn't do anything with the Bratzo because this was a pilot. Reform is not easy, even within the army. Like in 2012, they had this idea, right? They don't want to use the same priority for military intelligence as you use for engineering. It requires very different talents, right? Right? But it took like 8 years to integrate in the system. But change never comes fast. In 2020, they did change. But when they do that, they need to also somehow integrate the Bratzo policy. Okay? And they had a problem. Right? How do you exactly do that? The way they did that is they applied Bratzo only within tier. Okay? So it gives you advantage only within your own tier. That's what they did. Since the decision to integrate current ratings into branching process took place in a short time, the Army maintained the same strategy space for the new mechanism as in previous years. And basically, what they did is, everybody wants to use deferred acceptance, right? It's very fashionable. Lots of people promote it. So they said, you know what? We can use these adjustments and construct a priority ranking, both by tiers and this Bratzo policy, and just use the vanilla version of the individual proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. That gives the outcomes. And then the prices are again determined in a disconnected way.
Also, so when you say deferred acceptance, it's actually the deferred acceptance without this contract term.
So this is vanilla deferred acceptance, right? But with endogenous priority structure. But the issue is like they still want to use Brazzo at most for 25% of the positions, right? So as a result, to accommodate that, the price assignments were determined as follows. Subject to a maximum of the number of flexible price positions at any given branch, and following the reverse priority order of the branch, basically those who only have relatively lower priority need to pay the price if you are getting too much Brazzo. Okay? Cadets who indicate willingness to pay the increased price at their assigned branch are charged the increased price, and everybody else are charged the base price. So basically what this really means is, if you volunteered for Brazzo, you'll likely pay it unless the cap is already reached by lower priority. Okay. Now, in addition to inheriting the limitations of the earlier mechanism, this mechanism added new problems and bigger problems. Even though the number of flexible price positions at each branch was kept at 25% of the total capacity, priority upgrade due to increased price willingness was applied to all positions, right? That's the problem with using the vanilla version of deferred acceptance. As a result, they could use the vanilla version of the deferred acceptance, but now their system also introduced the second type of incentive compatibility failure, which we call strategic Brazzo. In Brazzo IC failure, you were regretting that you volunteered. Now, you might strategically benefit. Why? You get higher priority with Brazzo for all positions, but because too many people are applying, you don't need to pay for it anyways. So now, two opposite effects. So the end result was a mechanism that's highly complex and one with more widespread failures, including priority reverses that cannot be manually corrected ex post, and that is visible. So now this became more like Boston mechanism, where the issue is visible, very visible, and I'm started feeling it. Now, so the root cause of the failures are the same as this earlier mechanism, restricting message space and the lack of coordination between branch and price assignments. The USMA leadership immediately recognized the possibility of the detectable price, the priority reverses under this mechanism. So they knew trouble was coming. Okay. And they thought there'll be problem with trust. You know, cadets will be very upset. And to avoid that, they did a drive so that cadets can get a sense of, you know, the cutoff prices, so that, you know, they pick good strategies. Okay. So, but then they weren't sure that that would work. Let's say we are doing this dry run to avoid problems, but I don't know what a cadet will do with all that information, right? So they were worried. And indeed, so with actual data, this is the number of failures out of 1,000 cadets in the dry run versus the actual run out of 1,000. So they avoided a big part of the problem, but like maybe cut it by half. But compared to earlier years' average, it's way more, and with bigger problems which cannot be corrected ex post. Okay. At that point, the Army reconsidered the reform proposal I made earlier, and once again verifying that once you have a big enough improvement, then policymakers might be interested. Not with, you know, relatively, not with improvements they deem relatively small. A partnership is established with Parag Patak, myself, and the Army, with Carl Grimberg leading the reform efforts at USMA. And basically at that point, Army figured they can actually have the expanded strategy space. Indeed, cadets themselves demanded it. And now in the rest, maybe like half an hour, if you guys.
So I think we just, whoever who needs to leave, I think, feel free to leave,
Yeah, I mean, so I will not be offended a bit if you want to leave.
just to let you know, lunch reservation is 30 minutes later now. So
I mean, what is the list of my worries?
Okay.
So I inherited this from my advisor, William comes, like classes would go like 3 hours, and
I think you're going to 3 hours today.
so I'll not go 3 hours, and I'll go fast. So you might, so this part of the presentation will be analytical actually. Okay. So what is the model? And you might know a lot of this model. I'll go fast. There's a set of cadets I. There are two prices in the actual paper, in the newest version. You can have as many prices as you want, but I will present the version, all the results go through, everything goes through, okay, in the latest version of the paper. But the Army uses the one with two prices. T naught is base price, T plus is increased price, B is the set of branches, QB is the number of positions at the branch, QFB is the number of flexible price positions, meaning these prices can be given at increased price, but they don't have to be. So that's why I don't call it increased price. They are flex, and there is an upper cap on it. I mean, not on these positions, but how many of them you can use at the increased price, there's an upper cap. Cadet have strict preference over branch price pairs plus being unmatched. Assumption is cadets prefer not paying the extra price to paying it naturally. And each branch has a baseline priority. I'll not model here how it's determined. It comes with from order of merit list plus this tiering. Okay. And all that is done before the assignment process, anyways. Okay. So there is no wild assumption, hidden assumption here. This is the most important concept. Okay. Now, at each branch, this function specifically, given a baseline priority of ranking of the branch, this function explains who can jump ahead of other cadets who have higher baseline ranking and who cannot. Okay. Now, this could be anything for as long as for any given price, if I fix the price, it has to be the same as the baseline ranking, naturally. And secondly, being willing to pay extra can only help you, it couldn't hurt, right? So basically, this is the most general but reasonable policy to accommodate this Army's Brussels policy. Like this, so for the case of Army, I'll call this Brussels policy. This is like marginal rate of substitution, basically, right? It tells you, who can jump ahead, who cannot. And it could be based on tiers, like you can only jump within your tier. It could also be based on things like maybe you can always jump, like that was the case at the beginning. Like I call this ultimate Brussels policy. If you pay extra, you jump ahead of everybody. Not in all positions, only in positions, only for flexible price positions. Okay. Or maybe you can get like 10 extra points to your order of merit score, right? And indeed, this also has an application in direct application from China in the context of school choice. A contract is basically a cadet, a branch, and the term of their arrangement. And allocation is a set of contracts such that no cadet gets more than one assignment, no branch gets more assignments than its capacity, and of those, no more than this QFB one can be given at the increased price. Okay, like everything is obvious here. A is the set of allocations. For a given allocation X and cadet I, the assignment Xi of cadet I under allocation X is basically branch price pair BT if IBT is among these contracts in X, and it's empty set otherwise. And so nothing interesting. A mechanism is what it always is, a message space together with a function which maps each message profile to an outcome. And a mechanism is direct mechanism if the strategy space is simply the set of all preferences over branch price pairs. As it is customary, I'll denote the direct mechanism with its outcome function only given that the strategy space is identical. Our approach is axiomatic. And one thing that I learned over the years is explaining ideas to policymakers with axioms is way easier than with mechanisms or social choice rules. Because typically what they are trying to do are associated with axioms, and you'll see it here. Individual rationality means you cannot match any cadet and unacceptable, pair, branch price pair. Non-wastefulness means no position at a branch can be left idle while there is a cadet who is unassigned, unless she would rather remain unassigned than receiving the idle position at the cheap price. Like, I don't want this even at the cheap price. Only then this kind of idleness is possible. No prior to reversal is what I call fairness in Sönmez. No cadet should prefer a package of another cadet to her own assignment, even though she had higher baseline prior to for the branch. So basically, I'm jealous of somebody else. Like, I want their package, exact same package, not the branch. I'm not saying I want the branch. I'm saying I want the same branch price pair, and I have the higher baseline prior. Right? That doesn't make sense if they are assigned and I'm not. Right? So that I call no prior to reversal. Now, the most important technical part. Like, how is this different than no prior to reversal? No justified that. Or fairness. It's the same thing, right? But it's not. Because this is not the only way. Unlike in Sönmez standard world, this is not the only way I get access. Property rights are more complex, right? I can also get it towards Bratz. In particular, I might need to compare contracts which have different prices. So I can say things like, okay, if we don't get infantry at the expensive price, I want it at the cheap price. But don't give it to Fuito at the expensive price. Give me at the cheap price. That sounds like too much to ask, but sometimes it will be reasonable, right? Like, maybe the system was giving only 10 points advantage. Maybe Fuito had like 12 points less than. I apologize. I should have picked numbers other way around, right? So you shouldn't be able to get ahead of me with Bratzo, because like this Bratzo policy doesn't give you the lead, even with the expensive contract, right? So basically, I can demand somebody else's cheap contract, the expensive version though, No, I'm sorry. I can demand that I want somebody else's branch. He paid the expensive price, and I want it at the cheap price. Well, first of all, this will be viable if first, this is something I want to do. This is better than what I got. And second, if I'm J, my cheap, assigning it to me cheap, my cheap contract has higher Brasso priority than the expensive version. And this is always feasible. You can always assign something expensive to as something cheap, because there's no cap on the baseline positions. There's only cap on the expensive positions. So that is the notion of legitimate claim for a price release version. So that's when this is legitimate. This is the opposite. Legitimate claim for a price increase version. Now I say, when I got it cheap, I wanted the expensive. Don't give it cheap. I wanted the expensive. When would that be legitimate? Well, that would be legitimate if my expensive version has now higher priority based on this W function than Fuito's cheaper version. But there's one other issue. Maybe already 25% cap is done. Whereas you can convert the expensive contracts to cheap ones, you cannot always do the other way around. So I can do that only if, in the previous scenario, not all these privileges were used. Okay? And now you can also see how these conceptually relate to affirmative action, minimum guarantee, these are conceptually related, right? Okay.
Actually, I would ask you that question. So, if you add this axiom and the previous maybe three, including a non-Sönmez, is it going to be the same as a no?
This would be this can be interpreted as no justified enemy. And I have that's right. So, but first, that's not an axiom yet. It becomes axiom when I say that you never have either, an objection, legitimate objection for a price reduced or a price increase version. Whereas the other one was objection for the identical price version, right? So so these are different price no justified enemy kind of situation, right? And I call this enforcement of the price responsiveness policy, because it directly utilizes this omega function. Together, the last two axioms, no priority reversal and enforcement of the price responsiveness policy, intuitively corresponds to the notion of no justified enemy. It's just a more complex version of no justified enemy. But it's nothing, unintuitive. This is completely, it's very natural, right? So that's what Armin literally wanted. Like if somebody is giving you 10 points, if somebody is willing to give you priority for 25% of the positions, if you are willing to pay the increased tuition, so that 10 points is critical, right? If you're just 8 points extra, you cannot, if you need 12 points, you cannot utilize it. Last axiom is strategy proof, truth telling being dominant strategy. Dual price cumulative offer mechanism. This is for the case of two prices. If there are multiple prices, then multi-price. It's cumulative offer procedure of Hatfield and Milgram. I presume you guys know what this is. Together with the specific choice rule. What does this choice rule do? It first fills the open position, like base price positions, based on baseline priority, and then fills the remaining positions like, no, not remain, flexible price positions based on W function, Brussels policy, or price response and response. Very simple, right? And Hirata and Kasuya has also a related result to this. So basically, this mechanism is uniquely defined, this version of cumulative offer mechanism, and you can use any priority ranking with this choice rule and use the cumulative offer process. The outcome will be independent of that ranking, although there is a natural ranking here, which is order of merit list. Yes.
Question, so does the choice rule satisfy good properties like substitutability or low aggregate demand?
So it doesn't satisfy substitutes. It satisfies unilateral substitutes.
Oh, I see.
So now this last paper never used those notions. And indeed, you don't need to know that theory. So I used them in my first papers, but not in my last paper, although I know that I could have done it that way too. Like I did it directly. Okay. But this version of the model is, first of all, it's a generalization of Sönmez itself. It covers, like this Brussels policy W function is the ultimate Brussels policy in that paper, right? But this choice rule satisfies Fuito's condition with Hatfield, right? Unilateral substitutes, the more demanding one. Okay. And the main theorem is fix baseline priorities and price responsiveness policies. A direct mechanism satisfies individual rationality, non-wastefulness, enforcement of price responsiveness policy, no priority reversals, and strategic rules. And there is nothing here Army doesn't want. Right? That's what they intended actually, it's just too complicated. If and only if it's the dual price cumulative offer mechanism. And this whole thing extends to multiple prices, thanks to Hirata and Kasuya's technique actually that we use in them. There are other characterizations of the cumulative offer process and mechanism. But in all these papers, there are exogenous choice rules which satisfy certain technical conditions. Subject to that, you characterize cumulative offer choice. Whereas here, I'm not characterizing cumulative offer process. I'm characterizing a strict refinement of it. And I actually don't even need to know that earlier literature. I don't need to know anything about unilateral substitutes, bilateral lap substitutes. Like, so this Army's objectives already, once they are willing to accept the strategy space of ranking branch price pairs. What Army is trying to do directly implies both the outcome function and the choice. They're both endogenously determined. Okay. So basically in the paper, we don't need, like, if I could have avoided using even the notion of choice. I could have directly described the mechanism, don't use any matching with contracts terminology, like we would get exactly the same, right? So that's what's kind of unique, or at least first in this literature. And I think practical significance is obvious. And this problem has an application in school choice. Apparently, a direct application. Apparently, until recently, China had the following policy in high school assignments. You could receive increased priority at a fraction of the high school positions, like 10 or 15%, if you are willing to pay extra price, extra tuition. Now, Shanghai and Tianjin had two prices, base price. So they're exactly like ours. The analytical, the exercise in that paper had 4 prices. But remember, all the results extend to multiple prices. Okay, so it's a direct application. So, and you can have other applications where you want to have the following kind of priority structure. You want to use a merit ranking of some sort, but you want to give some advantage to people who are willing to make a costly investment, but subject to a cap. That's the key, right? And then you can have very flexible, Brussels policies or counter, price responsiveness policies. Like maybe at the beginning for the first year, you only give like 5 points advantage, but then for a little bit you give even more. You can do whatever you want. Due to equity considerations, apparently this was continued in 2015. Of course, they didn't know this mechanism. Like when I say direct application, like if it was continued, I would then approach them and try to change it. But they gave up this policy apparently. But they used more than 20 years. Basically, they used this policy with bad mechanisms for many years. Army so let me conclude. Army considered the design a success and also adopted it for ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, ahead of its scheduled time. It was planned for the following year, but they said, wow, but this is not everything we want. Everything is so clean. They adopted it immediately. They also identify additional ways to utilize the cumulative offer mechanism. And in general, this is basically also a theory about priority assignment where you use 2 types of priorities. The base priority applies a second priority where in a costly way you can improve priority. It's a very natural abstract model actually, right? So conclusion in terms of minimalist market design is, so basically this is a proof of concept for this institution design paradigm. It's very similar to what happened in Turkey and then Boston public schools, and basically being very systematic in that particular way made it clear that basically this is the system they really intended, right? It's just while trying to accommodate this price responsiveness axiom, they just failed to satisfy no priority reversal. So because the problem get complicated, axioms that were easy to implement suddenly became difficult for the layman, basically. Okay. This paradigm can be especially valuable in settings where the need for a change is not established and the reform is merely aspired by an outsider. But the intended institution is clear, but clear to us, not to policymakers, but finding it requires formalism and technical expertise. And when the mission of the institution cannot be fully described with that single dimensional objective function, so that you cannot solve this problem with mechanism design. It's just not feasible. We don't have that kind of machinery. My last point is, I think this effort shows the importance of theory in policy-oriented research, both peer theory and custom-made theory. I mean, you keep hearing theory is not important, it's irrelevant, big data. You cannot solve this problem with big data, not in the way we are able to solve, right? So it shows the importance of theory but not just abstract theory, also custom-made theory. So certainly, all of this didn't occur to me immediately. I benefited from insights by, Galen Shapley, Charles Crawford, Hatfield Milgram, Hatfield and Kojima, and Kenige, benefited greatly. And it improved my understanding of the problem. It showed me, it guided me, where a very good design is. But then, as always, I go back to the primitives and further milk theory, because that's what I'm good at. And that has been my strategy, basically, for policy. And I think this also illustrates that custom-made theory is also very important. Okay. But thank you very much, and I apologize for also making this a almost 2-hour session. But then we were able to squeeze in, another important application, kidney exchange, liver exchange, and also I think how the paradigm evolved. They have important role in evolution. The fit in living donor organ exchange is not as good as in school choice. In particular, the axiomatic element is not very needed in the living donor exchanges, but it also shows the promise of this program, right? The problems that I picked, axiomatic approach was particularly useful to, define the mission of the institution. But there can be other problems, and there are where approaches closer to mainstream paradigms might also benefit from some of the similarities. But thank you very much.